The mahogany conference table felt cold under my palms. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the smell of old paper and bitter coffee in Margaret Sloane's office. At 68 years old, after a career as an insurance executive, I had sat at hundreds of tables just like this one. But I had never sat at one to erase my own son from my future. Margaret folded her hands over the thick folder I had brought from home. Inside were copies of my existing estate documents, account summaries, and the plan I had spent years assuming would remain unchanged. A lifetime of work, roughly $2 million in assets, all arranged with one expectation: that most of it would eventually pass to my son. "Are you absolutely certain, Arthur?" Margaret asked. Her voice was quiet in the empty room. I looked at the folder. She said family only. Margaret did not ask for context. We had worked together too long for that. "I want the old plan replaced," I said. "Start drafting the new one. Thanks for watching. I'm see this videos at 17.7. We think once subscribe to the track to the videos. I want the look video. I want the two Margaret to the tech to the videos." 6 hours earlier, I had been standing on a sidewalk in the evening rain. The rain was light, just enough to make the pavement slick outside the Bristol Grill. I carried a small box wrapped in silver paper, a book on constellations for my grandson. It was my birthday, but I liked bringing something for the kids when we got together. Eric had told me to meet them at 7. The restaurant entrance smelled of expensive roasted garlic and damp coats. I walked past the host stand toward the private dining rooms in the back. Through the frosted glass of the Magnolia Room, I could see shadows moving. Someone laughed. A waiter stepped out holding an empty tray, and through the open gap, I saw it. A large white cake sitting on a side table. "Happy birthday, Arthur," written across the top in dark blue icing. I reached for the brass handle. The door opened before I could touch it. Vanessa stepped out and pulled it shut behind her with a soft click. My son's wife wore a navy silk dress. Not a single wrinkle on it. Her perfume was sharp, smelling of crushed flowers and alcohol. She smiled, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. The woman glanced over my shoulder at a couple walking past us toward the restrooms. "Family only, Dad," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, soothing, almost. I stood there. The small silver box felt heavy in my hand. Eric said 7. Eric misunderstood. Vanessa kept that practiced smile locked in place. "This is a networking dinner. My firm's partners are inside. We can do a small family lunch this weekend. Just us." She called me Dad. Then she told me I was not family. The two concepts sat next to each other in the air, refusing to blend. Through the glass panel of the door, a man turned around. Eric. My son held a wine glass in one hand, laughing at something a woman next to him had just said. Then he looked toward the door. Our eyes met through the frosted glass. He knew I was standing there. He knew it was my birthday. He knew my cake was sitting 10 feet away from him. I waited for him to set down the glass. I waited for him to walk to the door, open it, and tell his wife there had been a misunderstanding. Eric looked away. He stared down at his shoes, then turned his back to the door. Something broke open in my chest. A quiet, hollow snap. Vanessa smoothed the front of her dress. "We will call you tomorrow to set up lunch. Drive safe." She went back inside, and the door clicked shut again. I did not knock on the glass. I did not raise my voice or demand a scene. I simply turned around and walked back out into the rain. The drive home took 40 minutes. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth, squeaking against the glass. I kept the radio off. The silence in the car felt thick, pressing against my ears. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I took it out and looked at the glowing screen. A text from Eric. It read, "I will explain later." I locked the car and walked to the front door. I did not type a reply. There was nothing left to explain, because the glass door had explained everything. My house was dark. I turned on the kitchen light and set my keys on the counter. The metal clattered against the granite. Across the room, The oak dining table sat empty. 4 chairs. I pulled out the one at the head of the table and sat down in the quiet house. On the fridge, held up by a magnet, was an old birthday card my late wife had given me years ago. Her handwriting was elegant, loops of blue ink wishing me a long and happy life surrounded by the people we loved. I stared at the card, and then I stared at the empty chair across from me. For 14 years, I had treated Vanessa like a daughter. I had paid for emergency repairs, babysat on short notice, covered things they needed, because that was what family did. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Margaret Sloan. It was late, but lawyers answer when they know you. She picked up on the 3rd ring. Her voice was thick with sleep. "Arthur, is everything all right? I need to revise my estate plan," I said. "As soon as possible." I heard the rustle of sheets as she sat up. "All right. We can do that." "Did something happen? I just need to make some changes," I told her. She paused. "We can meet tonight if it is urgent. Come to the office. But I need to ask you something first to prepare the files." "Ask." "Do Eric and Vanessa know the full extent of your assets? The house, the brokerage accounts, the retirement funds? Do they know the total?" "No," I said immediately. "I never discuss numbers with them." "Are you sure?" Margaret sounded hesitant. "People talk, Arthur. Sometimes they guess." I opened my mouth to say I was absolutely sure, but the words stopped in my throat. A memory surfaced, and it felt cold against my skin. 3 months ago, Vanessa and I had been standing in this very kitchen. She had been pouring coffee, talking casually about inflation and the housing market. And then she had asked me a very specific question. She had asked if I was still keeping the bulk of my portfolio in municipal bonds. I had not thought anything of it at the time, just polite conversation. But I had never told Vanessa about my municipal bonds. I had never mentioned my portfolio structure to Eric, either. Not in years. I looked at the text message from Eric, still glowing on my phone screen. I will explain later. My son had not looked at me through the glass. His wife had treated me like a stranger on the sidewalk. They did not want me at their table. But as I sat in the silent kitchen, a terrible question settled in my mind. If Vanessa did not consider me family, how did she know exactly what my family was supposed to inherit? Sunlight hit the granite counter right where my keys rested, reflecting off the metal in a harsh glare. I had not slept much. The coffee tasted bitter, burned at the bottom of the glass pot, but I drank it anyway while watching the street through the kitchen window. The rain from last night had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and scattered with wet leaves. My phone vibrated against the stone at 8 in the morning. The caller ID showed Eric. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. "Dad." His voice sounded thin over the speaker. It carried that forced, casual tone he used when trying to smooth over a mistake. "About last night. In insensely summa daughter hope. On summa daughter hopeox. AT million. You do not need to explain a networking dinner, Eric," I said. Vanessa made it very clear. "Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you in the distance like the bell have working dinner. Thanks for watching." It was not like that. My son let out a heavy breath. She had partners from the firm there. Important clients. She just did not want things to be awkward, and you know how pressured she gets when she hosts work events. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The mug was almost too hot to hold. If it was a corporate dinner, why was there a cake with my name on it sitting in the room? Silence stretched across the line. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background on his end. "Eric," I said gently. "She ordered it earlier in the week," he finally muttered, "before the guest list changed. The restaurant just brought it out by mistake." He had no good answer. We both knew the restaurant would not bring out a personalized birthday cake for a corporate networking event unless someone had explicitly told them it was a birthday dinner. I told my son I had errands to run and ended the call before he could offer another hollow excuse. 14 years. That was how long Eric and Vanessa had been married. For 14 years, I had navigated my daughter-in-law and her unwritten rules about what constituted our family. Setting my phone down on the counter, I walked into the living room and looked at the framed photographs on the mantel. There was a picture of my 2 grandchildren playing in the snow 3 winters ago. Our furnace had died right before Thanksgiving that year. Vanessa had called me in tears, saying family helps family. I paid the heating company $4,000 that same afternoon to make sure the kids stayed warm. Next to it sat a photo from a summer soccer tournament. That had been another phone call. Vanessa had praised my generosity for 20 minutes, mentioning how wonderful it was that the children had a grandfather who could cover the expensive registration fees when their own household budget was tight. I never minded paying for those things. The money was meant to support them eventually anyway, and I gave freely. I kept no ledger of debts, but standing there in the quiet house, the double standard finally crystallized into something sharp and unforgiving. When they needed my time, my labor, or my wallet, we were family. When Vanessa needed to impress her firm's partners, I was an inconvenient old man who belonged outside in the rain. The phone rang again, pulling me away from the photographs. It was Margaret. My attorney did not waste time with pleasantries. "I have an opening on Tuesday morning for the formal meeting," Margaret said. "But we need to do this properly, Arthur. No rushed decisions based on a bad night. I need you to gather your current account summaries, the property deeds, your beneficiary designations, and the original copies of the old documents. I will have them ready," I told her. "Good. And Arthur." Margaret paused, her voice dropping to a serious register. "Think very carefully about what you want this new trust structure to actually do. Rebuilding an estate plan is not about sending a message. It is about protecting what matters." I promised her I would keep that in focus. After hanging up, I went into my home office. The small room smelled of old paper and the lemon wood polish my wife used to buy. I sat at the mahogany desk and opened my laptop. Margaret had asked for account summaries, which meant logging into the secure brokerage portal. But before I typed in the bank address, my hands hovered over the keyboard. My mind drifted back to the question Vanessa had asked in the kitchen 3 months ago. The comment about municipal bonds. I opened my email archive instead. The search bar blinked steadily against the white screen. I typed in Vanessa's name and the word bonds. A dozen emails populated the list. Mostly holiday planning, school schedules, and links to articles. But there, buried halfway down the screen from October of last year, was a message with the subject line regarding college savings accounts. I clicked it open. Vanessa had written a long paragraph about future education costs for the grandchildren. At the very bottom, tucked into a casual postscript, were 2 sentences that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle. "By the way, Eric mentioned the market volatility. I assume you are keeping your portfolio mostly in municipal bonds right now to stay safe." I read the words 3 times. I stared at the glowing screen until the black text blurred into gray lines. I had never told Vanessa about my municipal bonds. I had never discussed tax-advantaged investment strategies with her. During a dinner a few years ago, she had jokingly told a neighbor that her father-in-law was set for life. I had brushed it off as polite flattery. Looking at the email now, the joke felt like an appraisal. This was no lucky guess. Municipal bonds were specific. It meant someone had looked at the actual structure of my assets. Vanessa knew. She knew the rough composition of my accounts, which meant she likely knew the total value of my $2 million estate. I pushed my chair back from the desk. The wheels groaned against the hardwood floor. The silence in the office felt entirely different now. It was not empty anymore. It was crowded with suspicion. I pulled a yellow legal pad from the drawer and picked up a pen. I wrote down 3 names. First was Margaret Sloan. My attorney knew every cent I owned, but Margaret would rather lose her license than breach client confidentiality. Second was Daniel Price, my financial advisor. Daniel managed the accounts and sent the quarterly performance reports. He was a professional, but professionals sometimes made mistakes. Sometimes they answered questions from family members they assumed were authorized to know the details. Then I wrote the last name, Eric. I stared at the blue ink on the yellow paper. My own son. If Daniel had not leaked the information, there was only one other person on Earth who could have given Vanessa that level of financial detail. I picked up the phone from the desk. I did not call Vanessa. because I did not want an argument built on lies. I needed to find the source of the leak with absolute certainty. And the only way to find out if my son had betrayed my privacy was to pay a visit to my financial advisor. Daniel Price operated his wealth management firm out of a glass building on West Market Street. The air conditioning in his corner office hummed with a constant, expensive vibration, cooling the room to a crisp temperature. I sat in a leather chair that smelled faintly of saddle wax, and I watched the man pour 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe. We had done business together for over a decade. He knew my goals, my risk tolerance, and the exact balance of every account I owned. Arthur. Daniel handed me a porcelain cup. It is good to see you. Though you usually call before coming down, I did not touch the coffee. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling the familiar ache in my knuckles that always flared up when the weather shifted. Daniel, I have a very direct question for you, and I need a very direct answer. The financial advisor stopped moving. His practiced, welcoming expression shifted into something far more cautious. Of course. Whatever you need. Did you ever discuss my portfolio, my net worth, or the specific contents of my estate with my son? I let the question hang in the cold air of the office. Or with his wife, Vanessa? Daniel set his own cup down on the glass desk. The ceramic made a sharp clink against the surface. Genuine surprise registered in the younger man's eyes. Absolutely not, my advisor said, his voice quiet but firm. I have never shared your account balances or your estate structure with Eric or Vanessa. That would be a massive breach of my professional duty. Vanessa knew about the municipal bonds, Daniel. I did not tell her that. The advisor turned toward his computer monitors, his fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. I can show you the authorized contact logs right now. Eric is listed for medical emergencies, but there is 0 authorization on file for financial disclosures. My advisor turned the screen toward me. I leaned forward, scanning the neat rows of digital records. The log showed every phone call, every quarterly report mailed out, and every meeting we had ever held. Everything was restricted strictly to me, but as my eyes moved down the list of past appointments, a single entry from 12 years ago caught my attention. The note was dated just a few months after my wife passed away. It read, "Client meeting. Son present for emotional support. General estate transition discussed." A heavy feeling settled in my stomach as the memory came back. I had been completely lost in grief back then, barely able to sleep, let alone navigate tax laws. Eric had driven me to the office that day because I could not focus on the road. My son had sat right next to me while Daniel sketched out a long-term survival plan on a whiteboard. Daniel, I pointed at the screen. During that meeting 12 years ago, did we talk about numbers? The advisor looked at the date, and a heavy sigh escaped his lips. Not specific account balances, no. But we talked about the overall strategy. We discussed the fact that your house was paid off, and we mapped out how to protect the $2 million in general assets your wife left behind so you would never have to worry about long-term care. I rubbed my eyes. The pieces were finally locking together, and the picture they formed was incredibly ugly. I had spent the entire morning hoping for a corporate mistake. I had walked into this office praying that some junior accountant had accidentally forwarded a statement to the wrong email address. I wanted the betrayal to be a clerical error, but there was no error. I felt a deep wave of embarrassment for sitting in this office and questioning a man who had done nothing but protect my interests for a decade. I apologize, Daniel, I said, standing up from the leather chair. I was wrong to accuse you. You do not need to apologize. Daniel stood up as well, offering a sympathetic nod. Families talk, Arthur, and in my experience, people only need to hear a number once. They take that number, and they build a whole story around it. I left the building a few minutes later, stepping out into the bright afternoon sun. The heat radiated off the concrete sidewalk, but I still felt perfectly cold. My financial advisor had not betrayed me. The leak had come from inside my own family. Eric had heard that $2 million figure 12 years ago, and he had carried it back to his wife. When I reached my car, I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time without starting the engine. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a new text message from Vanessa. Dad, I am so sorry your feelings were hurt last night. The screen read. That dinner was just not the right environment for family tension. Let us get together this weekend and celebrate properly. I read the words twice, paying close attention to the way she constructed her apology. It was a masterpiece of social polish and emotional deflection. Vanessa did not apologize for leaving me on the sidewalk on my birthday. My daughter-in-law apologized that my feelings were hurt, framing my reaction as the problem. She called my presence family tension, making herself the victim of an awkward situation she had entirely created. For 14 years, I had accepted this kind of language because keeping the peace seemed more important than demanding respect, but the peace was already gone. I did not type out a long paragraph about the empty chair in my kitchen, and I did not demand an explanation for the glass door. I simply asked the only question that mattered anymore. How much do you think I am worth, Vanessa? I hit send, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and watched the digital clock on the dashboard. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The silence in the car grew thicker with every passing second. She did not reply. At 12 minutes, the phone suddenly lit up and began ringing loudly. But it was not Vanessa's name on the screen. It was Eric. I answered the call and put it on speaker. Dad. What is going on? Eric's voice was tight, high-pitched, and laced with undeniable panic. Vanessa just showed me her phone. Why in the world are you sending my wife aggressive text messages about money? I listened to his ragged breathing through the small speaker. My son was terrified, and that terror confirmed everything. The red herring was gone. There was no misunderstanding left to cling to. I am not being aggressive, Eric, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, steady register. I am just trying to understand how my family works. So tell me the truth. The truth about what? Eric stammered. What exactly did you tell your wife about my money? The line went completely dead quiet. The silence stretched through the phone speaker, heavy and absolute. I sat in my parked car, listening to the faint, static hum of the open line. Eric breathed in, a sharp, ragged sound, and exhaled slowly. My son told me he was coming over to my house, and the call disconnected before I could say a single word. I drove home and put a copper kettle on the stove. By the time the water began to whistle, tires crunched against the gravel in my driveway. I poured 2 mugs of Earl Grey tea, setting them on the kitchen island just as the front door opened. Eric walked in without knocking. The confident man who had been laughing inside the private dining room a few nights ago was entirely gone. In his place stood a nervous 42-year-old, his shoulders slumped, and his collar unbuttoned from a long day at the office. Sit down, Eric, I said. My son pulled out a stool but did not sit. Instead, he gripped the wooden backrest, his knuckles turning white under the bright overhead lights. I told her years ago, Eric blurted out. The words tumbled over each other, rushing to fill the quiet room. Right after Mom died, we were trying to figure out our own life insurance, and Vanessa asked if I would need to help support you as you got older. I told her no. I told her you were financially fine, and that you probably had around $2 million between the house and the retirement accounts. I picked up my tea. The ceramic burned against my palm, but the heat grounded me. $2 million. He had handed his wife the exact financial inventory of my life. Married couples discuss finances, Dad. Eric finally sat down, running a shaking hand through his hair. I just wanted my wife to understand that you were secure, that you would never need to move in with us or rely on our income to survive. It was not a big deal at the time. He sounded so desperate for me to believe him. And a small, weary part of me wanted to accept the excuse. I wanted to drink my tea, talk about the weather, and pretend my family was not fracturing right in front of me. But I remembered Vanessa standing at the restaurant door. I remembered the smooth, practiced tone of her voice when she told me the dinner was family only. Let me ask you something, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. Did you tell your wife my net worth because she was worried about my future? Or did you tell her because she was worried about what would be left for yours? Eric froze. A deep flush crept up his neck, settling into his cheeks like a rash. He opened his mouth, closed it, and stared down at the granite countertop. He would not look at me. It was the exact same physical reaction from the restaurant. Through the frosted glass of the dining room door, when I had caught his eye, my son had lowered his gaze to his shoes to avoid acknowledging me. He was doing it again now in my own kitchen, hiding from the truth of his own actions. "We never planned around your death, Dad," Eric whispered to the counter. "Did Vanessa ever ask about my will?" He shifted his weight on the stool. The wood creaked loudly, sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. "Not exactly. We just talked about what an inheritance might mean. Someday, college for the kids, maybe paying off our mortgage faster. Normal things." I watched him carefully, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked off the seconds, loud and rhythmic. Normal things. For 14 years, I had treated their household with respect, offering help whenever they asked for it. Meanwhile, my son and his wife had taken the sum of my life's work and casually assigned it to their own future goals while my heart was still beating. Eric was not some innocent bystander in this marriage. He had given her the numbers, and he had tolerated the entitlement that grew from them. I walked around the island and stood directly across from him. "You want to know the truth about my will, Eric? I will tell you. When your mother passed away, we set up a secure plan. After making sure my final expenses and medical care were covered, almost every single asset I owned was meant to go directly to you." My son finally looked up. His eyes widened, reflecting the warm kitchen lights. "But I called Margaret Sloane on the night of my birthday," I continued. My voice sounded hollow, echoing slightly against the tile backsplash. "I instructed my attorney to replace the entire structure. The old plan will not stand." Shock washed over his face, leaving him pale and completely motionless. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. Eric was not stunned because he knew the specific financial terms of the new trusts, since I had not revealed them. He was stunned because he suddenly realized the birthday dinner had triggered massive consequences Vanessa had never anticipated. She had tried to exclude an inconvenient old man from a networking event to protect her social image. And in doing so, she had unraveled a $2 million expectation. Eric stood up slowly, leaving his tea untouched on the island. He looked around the kitchen, glancing at the empty chair by the dining table, and then looked back at me. A heavy, suffocating weight hung between us. Neither of us knew how to cross the distance anymore. He walked to the front door, stopping with his hand resting on the brass knob. He did not turn around to face me. "It wasn't like we were counting on it, Dad," Eric said softly. Then he opened the door and walked out into the cool evening air. I stood in the hallway alone, listening to the sound of his car engine turning over in the driveway. The red taillights swept across the living room windows and faded down the dark street. I walked back to the kitchen and poured my cold tea down the stainless steel sink. I could not stop thinking about his final sentence. The specific phrasing gnawed at me. It did not sound like a spontaneous apology from a son trying to mend a broken bridge. It sounded practiced. It sounded exactly like a defensive line repeated during a hushed argument between a husband and a wife who knew they had been caught. My son claimed they were not counting on my money. But as I turned off the kitchen lights, a terrible thought took root in my mind. If they were not counting on it, I wondered what counting on a future inheritance actually looked like on a financial document. I did not sleep that night. By 8 in the morning, I was parked down the street from my son's house, watching Vanessa's silver SUV pull out of the driveway and head toward her firm. The children were already at school. Eric worked from home on Thursdays, so I knew he would be alone. I waited 5 minutes before pulling into the empty space she had just left, turning off the engine and listening to the silence of the suburban neighborhood. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Eric answered in yesterday's sweatpants and a wrinkled cotton shirt, looking exactly as tired as I felt. He did not seem surprised to see me standing on his porch. My son simply stepped aside and let me walk into the foyer. The house smelled like cinnamon oatmeal and rushed mornings. I followed him into the kitchen, stopping near the edge of the large granite island. "I do not want another argument," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "I do not want accusations. I came here for the truth. Before you left my house yesterday, you told me that you and Vanessa were not counting on my money. What exactly did you mean by that? Eric leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. I meant exactly what I said, Dad. We are not banking on your estate to survive. We both have good jobs. Then what are you doing with the number? I asked. You gave your wife an estimate of $2 million. People do not just sit on a number like that for 14 years without putting it somewhere. He looked at the floor, and a heavy sigh escaped his lungs. My son reluctantly admitted that they kept a household planning spreadsheet. It was a document Vanessa had started a few years into their marriage to track their retirement targets, college savings for the kids, and future assets. Show it to me, I said. Eric shook his head immediately, his posture stiffening. No, I cannot do that. That is our private financial data, Dad. It has our bank account balances and our mortgage details on it. If the estate I spent 40 years building has been entered into your household budget, it is no longer entirely private, I replied. I did not raise my voice, but I did not break eye contact either. I am not asking for your bank passwords, Eric. I want to see the page where my life becomes your future asset. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the hum of the kitchen refrigerator. Then he turned around and walked down the hall to his home office. I heard the faint, rhythmic whir of a printer warming up, followed by the slide of paper hitting the tray. When he came back into the kitchen, he held a single, freshly printed sheet of paper. He placed it face up on the granite island and took a step back. I put on my reading glasses and looked down at the document. It was a sterile grid of black lines and gray-shaded boxes, neatly organized into columns. The top section covered their current equity and baseline projections. I ignored all of that and moved my eyes down to a bold heading near the bottom of the page. Future assets. Directly underneath that heading was a single row of text. Dad inheritance. Estimated $1.8 million. Seeing the words printed in crisp black ink felt like walking into a freezing wall of water. My remaining life had been reduced to a clean, formatted line item. But the cruelty did not stop at the estimate itself. Below the $1.8 million figure was a detailed list of allocations. They had already divided it up. $500,000 was earmarked for a housing upgrade. Another $100,000 was designated for a kitchen and master bath renovation. The rest was split between investment contributions and an accelerated retirement target for Eric and Vanessa. These were not binding bank documents, of course. No commercial lender would ever accept a speculative inheritance as actual collateral. But the spreadsheet proved something much worse than a legal contract. It proved a mindset. I stared at the neatly aligned numbers, feeling a strange numbness spread through my chest. You spent it, I whispered, barely recognizing my own voice. No, Eric said quickly, stepping forward. Dad, look at it. It is just a scenario. Vanessa built most of this page, and she likes to run projections for different 10-year plans. It is not real money. I looked up from the paper and met his eyes. If it is just a hypothetical scenario, Eric, why does my death already have assigned jobs? My son opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out. He looked at the sheet of paper on the island like it was a live explosive. He had allowed his wife to take my eventual absence and turn it into a home renovation. Whether he had watched her type the number or discovered it afterward no longer mattered. He knew the projection existed, and he had allowed my name to remain there while they planned their future around money that could only arrive after I was gone. She handles the long-term numbers. Eric tried again, his voice weak. She updates the projections every few months. I looked back down at the spreadsheet to steady myself. The paper felt cold against my fingertips as I slid it closer to the edge of the counter. As I moved the document, a small line of gray text in the upper right corner caught my attention. It was an automated timestamp, printed straight from the software, showing the exact date the file had been saved and modified. I read the date twice to make sure my eyes were not failing me. The spreadsheet had last been updated on Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon, exactly 3 days before my birthday dinner. The numbness in my chest vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. Vanessa had not simply forgotten I was family when she stood outside that private dining room. She had updated her inheritance projections, counted my money, assigned it to her future house, and then looked me in the eye and told me I did not belong at her table. I kept my finger pressed against the edge of the printed paper, unable to look away from the automated timestamp sitting right there in the top corner. Tuesday afternoon. Exactly 3 days before the birthday dinner. I looked up from the kitchen island and locked my gaze on Eric. "Who typed this number in?" "Eric," I asked. My son rubbed the back of his neck, his face pale under the bright recessed lighting. "Vanessa," he admitted, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the refrigerator. "But she updates our financial projections all the time. It is just a routine thing she does at the end of every quarter to track our goals." "Show me the proof." Eric hesitated, looking at the spreadsheet, and then slowly walked down the hallway toward his home office. I followed close behind him. The room smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. He sat down heavily in his desk chair, clicking his mouse a few times before bringing up his email inbox. A bright white screen illuminated his tired face as he pulled up a message from his wife, and then he stepped aside so I could read the text myself. The subject line was simply labeled as "Budget Updates." Vanessa had attached the spreadsheet file to the email. Her message was short, efficient, and entirely devastating. "I updated the long-term numbers," she wrote. "This gets us closer to our renovation goals once your dad's estate eventually comes through." Reading the words made my hands feel completely numb. She had typed those exact sentences on Tuesday. During the exact same week, she ordered a custom cake with my name on it and then banished me to the sidewalk outside the restaurant. I rested my hand on the back of Eric's leather desk chair to steady myself. "Open the thread about the restaurant reservation," I told him. "Dad, please do not do this," Eric pleaded, staring at the floor. "Open it." He swallowed hard, clicked the search bar, and pulled up a text message conversation from Wednesday morning. Vanessa had forwarded the final guest list to him. Eric had asked why my name was removed from the table count. Her reply was sitting right there in plain text, impossible to misinterpret. "The partners from the firm expect a certain sophisticated atmosphere," she had typed. "Arthur is a good man, but he does not fit with this crowd. It will just be awkward for everyone involved. Keep him away tonight, and we can do a quiet family lunch with him on Sunday instead." I had the physical evidence right in front of me. But reading the cold words on a digital screen was not enough. I needed to look her in the eye when the truth finally came out. "Call your wife," I said, stepping away from the desk. "Tell her to come home immediately. Tell her there is a family emergency." My son picked up his phone with shaking hands and made the call. We waited in the kitchen for 40 minutes. Eric paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, pouring a glass of water and leaving it untouched by the sink. I sat on a wooden stool, listening to the heavy ticking of the wall clock. When tires finally crunched into the gravel driveway, the sound cut through the silence like a knife. The front door swung open. Vanessa hurried into the foyer, dropping her leather bag on a chair. She wore a sharp gray suit, her heels clicking rapidly against the floorboards as she rushed toward the kitchen. "Eric," she called out, breathless. "What is going on? Is it the kids?" She stopped dead when she saw me sitting quietly by the granite island. Her polished exterior faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly forced a bright, concerned smile onto her face. "Dad," she said, her voice dropping into that soothing register she used in public. "What a surprise!" "Eric said there was an emergency." I picked up the printed spreadsheet from the counter and held it out. "There is no emergency, Vanessa. We are just doing some routine financial planning." Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes scanning the paper in my hand. Seeing the bold heading for future assets, the woman lost all the color in her cheeks. She looked across the room at her husband, but Eric refused to meet her gaze. He stared out the window, leaving her completely alone in the lie. "You went through our private computers," she accused, her voice losing its sweet edge. "Eric showed me the document." I corrected her calmly. "He also showed me the email you sent on Tuesday. The one where you assigned my death a dollar value to pay for your new kitchen." Vanessa straightened her spine, crossing her arms like a shield. My son's wife did not apologize. Not a single flinch of regret crossed her face. Instead, she immediately tried to reframe the entire situation into a virtue. "We are raising 2 children, Dad," she said, speaking slowly as if I lacked the intelligence to understand basic arithmetic. We have a mortgage and college funds to think about. Looking at the long-term reality of our family finances is not a crime. It is responsible planning. Responsible planning, I repeated. You calculated your inheritance on Tuesday afternoon. On Friday evening, you decided I did not fit the sophisticated atmosphere you wanted for your firm's partners, and you shut a glass door in my face. So tell me something, Vanessa. I took a slow step closer, keeping my voice low and completely steady. Why does my money belong in your future if I do not belong at your table? Her jaw tightened. The polished mask was finally cracking, revealing the absolute panic underneath. Realizing charm would not work, Vanessa reached for her only remaining weapon. You are acting purely out of emotion, she snapped, her tone turning bitter. You are angry about one dinner, and now you want to punish us. But you are not just punishing Eric and me. You are punishing your own grandchildren. If you ruin their future over a bruised ego, you will have to live with that. I watched her try to use the kids as a human shield, and I felt nothing but a profound sense of relief. Any lingering guilt I had about calling my attorney disappeared completely. The grandchildren are perfectly safe, I told her. I am setting up secure, independent educational trusts for both of them. A professional trustee will oversee every single cent. I paused, making sure she understood the exact reality of her situation. The children will have everything they need for their future, but you will never have the power to touch a single dollar of it. Vanessa stopped breathing. Her eyes darted back and forth as her mind raced to calculate the damage. For 14 years, my daughter-in-law had carefully managed her image, keeping me close enough to extract favors but far enough away to avoid embarrassment. Now, the $2 million safety net she had woven into her perfect life was dissolving right in front of her eyes. What did you do? She asked, her voice trembling with genuine fear. What did you change? I looked at the woman who had tried to budget my death. Enough, I answered. Margaret Sloane kept her office on the second floor of a brick building downtown. Sunlight filtered through the wooden blinds, casting long, warm shadows across her polished desk. A thick stack of paper sat between us, smelling faintly of fresh printer ink and the bitter coffee she always brewed. This was the final draft of my new estate plan. I looked at the neatly stacked pages, remembering the day I signed the original version. 12 years ago, my hand had shaken as I held the pen because my wife had just passed away, and I wanted to make sure our son had everything he could ever need. Under that old structure, Eric would have received the house, the brokerage accounts, and the cash reserves outright. Margaret rested her hands on the file. You are removing the primary outright distributions, the attorney said, verifying my emailed instructions. This is a massive shift, Arthur. I am not making this decision out of anger, I told her, and the leather chair creaked as I leaned forward. If I wanted pure retaliation, I would just liquidate the accounts and leave it all to a charity out of spite. But I want consequences, Margaret, not collateral damage. I need to protect the people who actually need protecting. We went through the new structure line by line. First, we isolated a substantial block of funds specifically for my own retirement and long-term medical care. I would not rely on Eric or his wife if my health failed in the coming years. Next came the grandchildren. I instructed my lawyer to establish protected educational trusts for both of the kids. Who will act as the trustee? Margaret asked, her pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. An independent fiduciary, I replied immediately. A dedicated wealth management firm. Eric and Vanessa cannot have any signing authority or oversight. Those funds are strictly for college tuition and down payments on their first homes, not for their parents to absorb into a household budget to buy a new kitchen. My attorney wrote down the directive, nodding slowly. Then we moved to the remaining capital. Instead of leaving the bulk to Eric, I directed a large portion into a charitable legacy. We established a local program designed to provide apprenticeships and scholarships for young adults learning the electrical and plumbing trades. I had spent my career behind a desk managing insurance risk, but hard, honest physical labor always meant something to my late wife. It felt right to put the money toward a tangible future for kids willing to work for it. Margaret looked up from her notes. And your son? Eric receives a fixed, Limited sum, I said. Enough to buy a reliable vehicle or cover an unexpected medical emergency. But not nearly enough to fund a lifestyle. Setting her pen down, the lawyer watched me carefully across the desk. Arthur, let me give you a piece of professional advice. Do not use an estate plan as a temporary threat. If you are doing this just to force an apology out of your daughter-in-law, do not sign these papers today. This is not leverage, I told her, keeping my voice perfectly level. I am not dangling dollars over their heads to make them behave, and I will not use this document as a weapon. This new plan simply reflects the truth of my family as it exists today. Margaret accepted my answer without another word. Her staff brought in the final documents, and we went through each required signature, witness, and notarization step for the estate plan. I signed only after Margaret confirmed that every document had been executed with the proper formalities. The quiet scratch of my fountain pen against the heavy paper felt entirely different this time. 12 years ago, signing my will felt like preparing for the end. Today, it felt like closing a door that had been left open to a freezing draft. Stepping out of the law office a short time later, the warm afternoon air hit my face. Traffic hummed along the busy street, and a vendor on the corner was roasting almonds. The scent of caramelized sugar drifted past me, sweet and grounding. For the first time in over a decade, I did not feel the crushing obligation of preserving every dollar I owned for a future I would not live to see. I had spent 14 years waiting for an invitation to my own family, and I was finally done waiting. When I returned to my house, I walked straight to the hall closet and pulled down a dusty cardboard box from the top shelf. Inside were photo albums and travel brochures my late wife had collected during our marriage. We had always talked about taking a train trip through the Canadian Rockies. The glossy pamphlets showed glass dome cars, snow-capped mountains, and pristine glacial lakes. We pushed the trip off year after year, saving the money for college, then the wedding, and then their first down payment. Then she got sick, and the trip vanished entirely. Carrying the brochures into the kitchen, I opened my laptop on the granite island. The keys clicked softly as I navigated to the railway website. A week in a glass-domed train car with luxury lodges and private chefs came with an expensive premium price tag, and the total cost was more than I usually spent on myself in 6 entire months. I did not hesitate. Typing in my credit card information, I hit the confirmation button. The screen loaded, displaying a bright green checkmark as a receipt appeared in my inbox. I let out a long, slow breath. The house was completely quiet, but it did not feel like a museum of memories anymore. I was finally using my resources to create a present reality instead of just hoarding them for a speculative inheritance event. I stood up to make a fresh cup of coffee, but a sharp buzzing sound broke the silence. My phone vibrated against the granite counter, sliding slightly toward the edge. Picking the device up, a new text message from Vanessa glowed brightly on the screen. Eric says you are making changes that affect our family. We need to talk. I stared at the specific words she chose. Our family. She only invoked that sacred boundary when the financial consequences became incredibly real. Locking the screen, I slid the phone into my pocket and went back to looking at the pictures of the mountains. The doorbell chimed twice, a sharp sound cutting through the quiet afternoon. I opened the heavy front door and found my son standing on the porch with his wife. Vanessa wore a crisp beige trench coat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest to ward off the autumn chill. Eric stood a full step behind her, staring down at the welcome mat. Can we come in? Vanessa asked. Her tone carried a brittle, practiced edge. Eric said we needed to have a family conversation. I stepped aside, leaving enough room for them to pass into the foyer. The scent of her expensive floral perfume filled the narrow hallway, masking the faint smell of roasted coffee from my kitchen. We walked toward the back of the house, taking our places around the large granite island. It was the exact same spot where I had confronted Eric with the printed spreadsheet just a few days earlier. You are making a permanent decision over one dinner, Dad. Vanessa started immediately. The woman did not bother to take off her coat or sit down. A single misunderstanding at a restaurant, and you are throwing away 14 years of family history. It is completely disproportionate. Crossing the room, I opened a drawer and retrieved a thick manila folder. The paper landed on the stone counter with a soft slap. "This is not about one dinner, Vanessa," I said. I opened the cover. Inside sat the printed spreadsheet page and the emails Eric had shown me. Let us review the sequence of events. First, you told Eric that I did not fit the sophisticated atmosphere you wanted for your firm's partners. Then you ordered a custom birthday cake with my name on it and told me the gathering was family only, leaving me outside the room. My daughter-in-law pressed her lips into a thin line. She glanced at her husband, but Eric kept his gaze fixed on the stainless steel refrigerator. "Before any of that happened," I continued, tracing my index finger down the printed spreadsheet, "my son disclosed my approximate net worth to you. You took that $2 million estimate, placed it into this document, and assigned my eventual death a specific monetary value to pay for a kitchen renovation. Finally, you updated those exact numbers 3 days before my birthday." I pushed the paper across the smooth surface toward her. "You did not exclude me because of a social misunderstanding. You excluded me because you already had my money neatly categorized in your mind. I was just taking up space. I never wanted you dead," Vanessa shot back. Her voice rose, bouncing off the hard tile walls. "None of this means I wanted you to die. It is just math. I know you did not want me dead," I agreed softly. "That would require actual malice. Your problem is much quieter. You simply turned my eventual absence into a financial assumption. You looked at a living person and saw a future asset." The kitchen grew completely still. Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but a sudden movement interrupted her. Eric finally turned away from the appliance and looked directly at his wife. "My father was still alive, Vanessa," my son said. The words sounded hollow. Stripped of all his usual corporate confidence, she whipped her head around to stare at him. "It was planning. Eric, we have a mortgage. We have 2 children who will need college tuition in a few years. It was just responsible financial planning." "No." Eric shook his head, his shoulders dropping under an invisible weight. "We planned around him being gone. We did it together, under some places of Tumai. We did it together. We have country devil by. We have country devil. We have country devil by. We have country devil. We have country devil by. We have country devil." Vanessa blinked, entirely taken aback by her husband breaking ranks. The united front they had maintained for 14 years fractured right there on the hardwood floor, searching for leverage. The woman quickly pivoted and reached for her usual shield. "The children," she insisted, turning back to me with wide eyes. "If you cut us off, you are punishing your own grandchildren. They rely on that stability for their future. The grandchildren have their own dedicated, independent educational trusts now," I told her, shutting the argument down before it could breathe. "A professional trustee will manage their college funds and their first house down payments. They are completely protected." I watched the realization wash over her face as she lost her final bargaining chip. The kids were safe, which meant she could not use them to guilt me into restoring her access to the primary estate. "I am not going to give you exact dollar figures today," I said, closing the manila folder. "But I will tell you this. Eric will receive a limited sum. It will be enough for true emergencies, but it will never be enough to fund your future lifestyle, your renovations, or your early retirement. My direct inheritance is no longer your financial plan." They left a few minutes later. The silver SUV backed out of my driveway, moving much slower than usual down the suburban street. The house returned to its normal state of quiet, and yet the air inside felt noticeably lighter. Later that evening, I drove across town to the community vocational center. The brick building smelled of fresh sawdust, floor wax, and hot metal from the welding shop. I walked into a brightly lit classroom where 20 young men and women sat at heavy wooden workbenches. The director of the program stood at the front of the room, introducing me as the primary sponsor for their new electrical and plumbing apprenticeship initiative. A young man in the front row stood up and shook my hand. His grip was firm, his palms rough from actual physical labor. He thanked me for the scholarship that would pay for his certification tools. I smiled, feeling a genuine, steady rhythm return to my chest. For the first time in over a decade, I saw my resources doing something real. The money was not sitting in a dark account, waiting for a funeral so someone could buy expensive cabinets. It was building a foundation for people who actually wanted to build things. 3 days passed without a single word from Eric or Vanessa. On Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting on my back porch, watching the autumn wind rustle through the oak trees, when my phone rang. The screen displayed Eric's name. I answered the call, expecting him to ask about a weekend visit or perhaps offer another apology. Instead, my son let out a long, exhausted breath into the receiver. "Dad," Eric said quietly, sounding completely defeated. "She sent me out to the garage to call you privately." "What does she want, Eric?" "She wants to know exactly how much is left for us in the new trust." I looked out at the yard, watching a stray brown leaf drift down onto the grass. The answer was incredibly simple. "Then she still hasn't understood," I replied. The phone call with Eric ended on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and autumn quickly bled into the bitter chill of early winter. I did not sit by the front window waiting for another forced apology or another family meeting. Instead, I packed a heavy canvas duffel bag, called a taxi to the airport, and took a flight up to Vancouver. For 8 days, I sat in a glass-domed train car carving its way through the Canadian Rockies. It was the exact trip my late wife and I had pushed off year after year to save for our son's future. Snow-capped peaks stretched out in every direction, reflecting the bright morning sun against the pristine glacial lakes. Sitting in a plush leather seat, drinking black coffee while watching the dense pine forests blur past the window, I realized the heavy tightness in my chest was completely gone. I was no longer an invisible, static line item on a budget spreadsheet. I was just a man, enjoying the crisp morning air. Coming home to my quiet house in December felt entirely different than it had on the night of my birthday. The space felt earned, rather than merely preserved for someone else to eventually inherit. I began looking at real estate listings for smaller, single-story properties on the edge of town, realizing I simply did not need 4 empty bedrooms gathering dust just to maintain an image of past success. Over the next few weeks, I began seeing the consequences without having to ask about them. During one of his calls, Eric mentioned that they had dropped their plan to move into a larger neighborhood. The brick colonial they had been considering went under contract to another family. And when he stopped by my house a few days later, he was still driving the same sedan he had owned for years. I did not ask about Vanessa's plans or their household budget. I did not need to. For the first time, whatever future they planned would have to be built on the money they actually earned, not on an inheritance they had already assigned jobs to while I was still alive. But seeing me use my own resources proved to be too much for Vanessa to tolerate quietly. My daughter-in-law interpreted the Canadian trip and my local apprenticeship donations as direct, malicious retaliation against her household. She drove to my house on a Tuesday evening, parking her silver SUV at a sharp, crooked angle in the driveway. Her tires kicked up loose gravel onto the winter grass. Eric followed her up the front walk, looking pale and exhausted under the porch light. When I opened the heavy front door, Vanessa pushed past me without a single word of greeting. Her usual polished composure was beginning to crack. She wore a dark sweater that looked hastily pulled on, and her hair lacked its usual perfect styling. We gathered around the kitchen island, but the woman refused to stand still, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. "We need to talk about what is happening to the estate," Vanessa demanded, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You are completely liquidating everything, Dad. You are throwing away the entire family legacy." I poured myself a glass of water from the tap, taking my time before turning to face her. "I am not liquidating anything, Vanessa. The primary accounts are perfectly secure. You just paid for an entire semester of trade school tuitions for strangers," she shot back, gripping the edge of the granite counter until her knuckles turned white. "You took a luxury vacation across Canada. You are talking to real estate agents about selling this house. If you keep burning through the capital out of spite, there will be absolutely nothing left to pass down." Eric stood near the stainless steel refrigerator, staring blankly at the floor tiles. He looked like a man trapped in a burning building, desperately wishing he had found the exit years ago. "I am not burning through capital," I explained calmly, keeping my posture relaxed. "My retirement and long-term medical reserves are fully funded, so I will never be a financial burden to you." The grandchildren have their independent educational trusts secured with a professional fiduciary firm. After those obligations were met, I established a charitable program that means something to me, and I started actually using the rest. Vanessa shook her head rapidly, refusing to accept the boundaries I had drawn. It is reckless. You are taking money that was meant for this family and just giving it away because you are angry at me. It is completely unfair to Eric. Eric receives a fixed, limited sum, I told her, setting my water glass down on the stone surface. He will have enough to handle a medical emergency or fix a broken roof, but my daily accounts are no longer tied to your future lifestyle. The finality of the statement hit her like a physical blow. The absolute certainty of losing the $2 million safety net she had planned her entire life around broke the last remaining piece of her social mask. "You cannot do this," Vanessa yelled, her composure shattering completely. "You are spending our inheritance." The words ripped through the kitchen, harsh and echoing against the walls. Total silence followed. A heavy, suffocating quiet descended on the room, thick enough to choke on. The refrigerator hummed softly. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Eric slowly lifted his head and looked at his wife. A look of complete devastation washed over my son's face as he finally heard the absolute truth of her entitlement spoken aloud. She had not said family legacy, and she had not said my life savings. She had claimed the money as her own personal possession while I was standing right in front of her breathing. I looked at the woman who had barred me from a private dining room. "No, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice soft but incredibly firm. "I am spending my life." She opened her mouth, searching frantically for a way to walk the sentence back, but I did not give her the chance. "You told me that birthday dinner was family only," I continued, holding her panicked gaze. "I finally understood what you meant, and because I understood, my money no longer needs a seat at your table either." Vanessa turned toward Eric, her hands shaking as she reached out to him for support. "Tell him he is being unreasonable, Eric. Tell him." My son did not reach back. He stepped away from the granite island, creating a clear physical distance between them. "He is not being unreasonable," Eric whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of the realization. "You just proved exactly what he has been saying this entire time." The defensive wall she had spent 14 years building collapsed into dust. Without Eric standing beside her to validate the entitlement, Vanessa had nothing left to hide behind. She picked up her car keys from the counter, her face flushed red with humiliation, and walked out the front door without saying another word. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving Eric and me alone in the quiet kitchen. I expected my son to follow her to the car. I expected him to choose the path of least resistance, just like he had done outside the restaurant on my birthday. But Eric remained standing by the refrigerator. He looked at the empty chair sitting by the dining table, and then he looked back at me. "Is there any way I can fix what I did?" Eric asked softly. The quiet in my kitchen felt completely different after Vanessa left. The heavy, suffocating tension that had filled the room for the past hour was gone, replaced by the low hum of the stainless steel refrigerator and the steady ticking of the hallway clock. Eric stood near the granite island, his shoulders slumped as he looked at the empty chair pushed under the dining table. My son turned his head and looked directly at me. He had just asked if there was any way to fix what he had done. "You cannot fix the past by asking for the money back, Eric," I told him, keeping my voice steady and calm. "You cannot unring the bell, and you cannot erase the fact that you knew those numbers were sitting in that spreadsheet. Trust is not a financial transaction. It requires changed behavior." Eric nodded slowly, taking a step away from the counter. He did not offer a vague, sweeping excuse to cover his tracks, and he did not try to share the blame. "I am sorry," my son said, his voice cracking slightly under the bright overhead lights. "I am sorry for giving Vanessa the financial inventory of your life 12 years ago. I'm sorry I sat at my desk and allowed her to build a budget around your death. And I am so sorry I sat behind that frosted glass door on your birthday, drinking wine while you stood outside in the rain." It was the most honest sequence of sentences he had spoken in 14 years. Hearing him acknowledge the specific pain of that night loosened a tight, cold knot that had been sitting behind my ribs for weeks. "I accept your apology, Eric," I replied, feeling the truth of the words as I said them. It is a good place to start. But the new estate plan stays exactly as it is. He did not argue. He did not beg or negotiate. My son simply nodded his head, zipped up his jacket, and walked out the front door into the dark evening. The bitter cold of that winter eventually broke, giving way to a wet, heavy spring. Over the next several months, Eric started coming over to my house on Sunday afternoons. We would sit out on the back patio, drinking black coffee while listening to the rain hit the concrete. He talked about his projects at the firm, and he told me stories about the children playing in their weekend soccer leagues. We never discussed my bank accounts, and he never once asked about the exact balance of the new trusts. His marriage survived the fallout, but the strain of their new reality left undeniable cracks in the foundation. Eric told me they had started seeing a marriage counselor every Thursday evening to work through their communication boundaries. They were finally forced to navigate their lives together without a massive financial safety net waiting in the background. As for Vanessa, I saw the consequences mostly from a distance. Eric told me they had abandoned their plans for a larger house, and whenever I saw Vanessa at the children's events, she was still driving the same vehicle. There were no criminal charges, no courtroom battles, and no dramatic public downfall. There did not need to be. The consequence was simpler. The inheritance she had built into their future plans was no longer available to fund them, but the most profound consequence was her absolute loss of control over the family structure. When the time came to discuss early college preparations for the grandchildren, Vanessa could not manage the money. She had to submit formal, documented requests to the professional fiduciary firm that oversaw the educational trusts. An independent manager reviewed the tuition invoices and issued the checks directly to the schools. She could not touch a single cent of the capital, and she could never again use my grandchildren as leverage to force me into compliance. Her perfect social mask had cracked, and she had to live every day knowing that the people who mattered saw right through it. Late in May, the Community Vocational Center hosted a banquet to celebrate the first graduating class of their apprenticeship program. The event was held in a rented community hall across town. It smelled of roasted chicken, sweet barbecue sauce, and strong industrial coffee. The floors were scuffed linoleum, and the bright fluorescent lights hummed loudly against the ceiling. It looked absolutely nothing like the upscale private dining room at the Bristol Grill, and it was the most beautiful room I had seen in years. I arrived early, wearing a simple gray suit, and watched the young men and women walk through the doors with their proud families. A few minutes before the dinner started, the double doors at the back of the hall swung open, and Eric walked inside. He still wore his work clothes, having driven straight across town through heavy traffic to be there. Vanessa did not accompany him, and I did not ask why she stayed home. The boundary between us was firmly set, and we both respected the lines that had been drawn. A young man I had sponsored through the program walked over to greet me. He had rough, calloused hands from the welding shop, and he carried 2 plates of food toward a long folding table. He smiled broadly, shaking my hand before introducing me to his parents. "Mr. Bennett," the program director called out, stepping up to a small wooden podium at the front of the hall. He tapped a microphone, generating a brief squeal of feedback that quieted the crowd. "We are getting ready to start the presentations. Where do you want to sit tonight?" I looked around the busy, loud, brightly lit room. There were no reserved place cards, no frosted glass doors, and no exclusive guest lists designed to keep people out. It was just a room full of people who had showed up to celebrate hard work, honest effort, and a genuine future. Spotting an empty wooden folding chair near the middle of the room, right next to where my son was standing, I walked over and pulled it out. "Right here is fine," I answered. Sitting down next to Eric, I listened to the hum of the crowd and felt a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The most important change I had made on the night of my birthday was not the list of beneficiaries on a legal document. The real change happened when I finally stopped waiting for people who excluded me to tell me where I belonged. An inheritance is a gift, not a debt. And as the program director began to speak, I realized I was finally spending my life exactly where I wanted to be. Maybe that was the lesson I had been too busy saving to understand. An inheritance was never supposed to become a reservation someone else made against my death. It was a gift, and a gift still belonged to the giver until the day he chose to give it. I had protected my grandchildren. I had left Eric a path back to me that had nothing to do with money. And for the first time in years, I had stopped preserving my life for people who were already planning what to do when it ended. If someone you loved had quietly built their future around your inheritance while treating your presence like an inconvenience, what would you do? I would like to hear your answer.